The neighborhood of Willowcrest had always projected an image of order. Perfect hedges, identical mailboxes, driveways free of oil stains, and lawns measured down to the millimeter of allowable grass height. The kind of neighborhood that looked peaceful to an outsider, but simmered with the quiet tension of a dozen homeowners trying to outcontrol one another. At the heart of that tension stood the HOA president, Meredith Halstenbetter, known among the residents as Karen-in-Chief. Her reign over Willowcrest was not elected, so much as imposed through the sheer force of intimidation and passive-aggressive newsletters. She had treated rulebooks like Holy Scripture and violation notices like currency. A bicycle left leaning against a garage door for longer than 3 minutes. Warning issued. A wreath that did not conform to the seasonal color palette. Fine delivered. A dog barking more than twice in a 5-minute window. Mediation demanded. The homeowners complied, some out of fear, others out of exhaustion. But none of them expected what happened to my family, an event so shocking that it would shake the foundation of the HOA, and ultimately land everyone in a courtroom where justice would play out in a way Meredith could never have. Imagined it started innocently, as terrible things sometimes do. With my son's science fair project, my boy Sam had spent weeks building a homemade volcano in our garage. He was so proud, sculpting the papier, MCH slopes, painting the crater, and setting up his carefully controlled reaction mechanism. The chemicals he used were the standard household ingredients approved by the School's simple mixture intended to bubble, foam, and create a dramatic but harmless eruption. Everything was stored safely, labeled, and triple-checked by both me and my wife. But Meredith saw the setup one afternoon as she patrolled the streets during her daily inspection walk. She had always believed children were inherently unpredictable nuisances, capable of bringing chaos into her curated world. When she spotted the box of materials on our garage workbench, she reacted as if she had discovered a ticking bomb. Without bothering to understand their purpose or harmlessness, she marched to the HOA board group chat, issuing alerts about a chemical hazard. She announced with the fervor of a self-appointed savior that she would take immediate action before the entire street went up in flames. Naturally, we knew nothing of this. My wife was at work in the city courthouse, where she served as a legal advisor, although her exact position was something she kept relatively private, especially around contentious residents. I was inside preparing dinner, and Sam, blissfully unaware of the commotion brewing outside, was drawing diagrams for his volcano's presentation. The sun dipped lower that evening, casting long shadows across the driveway. When Meredith returned, armed not only with her sense of righteous authority, but also with something far more dangerous, a spray bottle filled with a harsh cleaning agent she referred to as her decontamination solution. It was nothing short of reckless. The substance was meant to strip mold from concrete, not to be anywhere near children, let alone sprayed around them, but Meredith had convinced herself that our family, and particularly our son, posed an imminent public threat. Sam stepped outside at the worst possible moment. Holding his volcano as he tested where best to place it for drying, he froze when he found Meredith standing on her property, leaning over his materials, muttering about bylaws and safety threats. Before he could even process what she was doing, she unleashed the spray. A mist of corrosive droplets arced directly toward him, catching the evening light for a brief second before landing across his sleeves, hands, and the front panel of his volcano. The acid was diluted strong enough to burn fabric and skin, but not potent enough to cause life-altering injury. Still, the sting was immediate. Sam cried out. The volcano slipped from his hands, and when I heard the sound, I rushed outside, finding my son clutching his arms in shock and pain while Meredith scolded him as if he had purposely endangered the neighborhood. The next hours were a blur of emergency room visits, medical paperwork, and Sam's trembling recounting of the incident. Doctors assured us that, though painful, the burns were treatable, and he would fully recover. My wife held him the entire time, her expression calm but tight, the anger beneath her surface simmering in a way only a mother could feel. By dawn, word had spread across Willowcrest, whether through curiosity, guilt, or self-preservation. Neighbors emerged from their homes with murmured discussions about the incident. For the first time, people realized that Meredith's obsessive authority had crossed a boundary. But Meredith herself felt no remorse. Instead, she sent out a community-wide bulletin accusing our family of storing hazardous materials, claiming that her intervention prevented a disaster, and insisting she had acted within her rights as HOA president. It was a spin so delusional that even her most loyal rule followers hesitated to agree. My wife decided action was necessary. She gathered documentation, photographs, medical reports, and eyewitness accounts from several neighbors who had seen Meredith prowling around that evening. She prepared a civil complaint that outlined negligence, trespassing, and reckless endangerment. And when she filed the case, the county courthouse assigned a judge someone neutral, someone professional, someone who would ensure justice, or so Meredith believed. The day the court hearing was scheduled, Meredith strutted into the courthouse with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable. She expected the judge to sympathize with her authority, nodding along as she painted herself as the hero who saved Willowcrest from scientific disaster. She even wore a blazer embroidered with the HOA emblem, as though representing a government institution. Rather than a suburban committee, she stepped into the courtroom without realizing the truth waiting behind the bench. Being quiet for weeks, not secretive, just patient. She knew the law. She knew procedure. And she knew that the person who would hear the case held personal stakes deeper than any HOA dispute, because the judge presiding over the matter, the one, Meredith assumed, would validate her behavior, was none other than my wife herself. It was not favoritism nor manipulation. The assignment had been random, but fate had a sense of irony. Still, before the proceedings even began, a new storm was brewing inside that courtroom, one that would expose years of unchecked abuse of power and reveal truths that Meredith had been desperate to hide. And as the bailiff called the court to order, the tension in the air tightened like a drawn bowstring. The reckoning was about to begin. The courtroom held the kind of sterile calm that seemed almost artificial, as though the walls themselves were trying to contain the tension radiating from every person inside. It was early morning, yet the benches were filled. Neighbors from Willowcrest had arrived in clusters, whispering among themselves, trying to appear casual while clearly eager to see how the spectacle would unfold. Even those who had long feared Meredith's wrath now found themselves curious, drawn by the unspoken hope that her reign of unchecked authority might finally be challenged. Meredith entered with the stiff posture of someone certain she would win. She tossed self-satisfaction into each step, greeting the bailiff as though expecting special recognition. She carried a binder bulging with documents, violation notices, bylaws, selective screenshots of HOA policy rules, everything she believed would cement her righteousness. And then she looked toward the judge's bench. For a moment, she did not recognize the woman sitting there. My wife wore her judicial robe with a composed, impassive expression, the kind of neutrality that allowed no hint of personal connection. Meredith saw a stranger she believed she could sway. A stranger who, in her mind, would validate her behavior as a community leader. She had no idea. The session began with the usual formality, the structured recitation of legal phrases, the acknowledgement of parties, and the listing of charges. The accusation assault with a corrosive agent, trespassing, and reckless endangerment hung in the air like a heavy fog. Meredith pressed her lips together, appearing deeply offended that such words could ever be associated with her. The judge reviewed the preliminary evidence with calm efficiency. On the surface, there was nothing to separate her from any other presiding official, no sign of personal involvement, no betrayal of emotion. Yet for those who knew her well, there was a subtle tension in her posture, a restrained fire beneath her calm exterior. She was not simply weighing facts, she was balancing law with the raw memory of seeing her son covered in acid-burned fabric. But Meredith, oblivious to nuance, interpreted the calm professionalism as an opportunity. She began her defense with long-winded justifications, insisting she had acted in service of the community. She framed herself as a guardian, protecting innocent residents from negligent homeowners. She presented HOA bylaws as though they were state legislation, wielding charts and lists to overcomplicate what had simply been a child's science project. While she spoke, the courtroom's mood shifted. Neighbors exchanged glances. Some rolled their eyes. Others subtly shook their heads. A few watched the judge closely, wondering how she managed to maintain such composure while hearing the woman who had injured her son turn the narrative into a bizarre tale of heroism. Piece by piece, the judge asked clarifying questions, measured, concise, unyielding. She requested timestamps. She asked for the exact moment Meredith decided entering private property without permission constituted responsible leadership. She questioned the necessity of carrying a corrosive agent during her neighborhood patrol, and though her tone remained level, every question peeled away layers of Meredith's facade. Slowly, the cracks began to show. Meredith's explanations wavered. Her confidence faltered in small but telling ways. Her justifications contradicted earlier statements, and when pressed, she resorted to evasive phrasing. As her composure thinned, she attempted to redirect blame onto our family, onto the HOA board, even onto the manufacturer of her cleaning spray. Then came the witnesses, one by one. Neighbors stepped forward, those who had long lived under the weight of her aggressive oversight. Each testified not with spite, but with the kind of resigned honesty born from years of exhaustion. They described patterns of harassment, misuse of authority, and threats disguised as safety protocols. Some recounted seeing her lingering on private driveways, photographing backyard items, rifling through garbage bins, or leaving warnings for matters so trivial they bordered on absurdity. Each testimony chipped away at the persona she had constructed, and for the first time, Meredith showed fear not dramatically, not openly, but in the subtle incline of her shoulders, the quickened breath, the tightening grip on her binder. Still, she held on to one belief, the belief that the judge was merely sympathetic to the community's complaints. She still did not recognize her, at least not yet. It was only when the photograph entered evidence the photos of our son's burned clothing, taken at the emergency room, that the courtroom shifted from tense to solemn. The melted fibers, the mottled discoloration on the sleeves, the faint outline of droplets etched into the fabric told a story harsher than any spoken testimony. The judge took her time examining it, not as a mother, but as a legal professional weighing the gravity of harm. The silence that followed was heavier than the swell of gasps or murmured conversations. It was the silence of realization that the incident had not been an overreaction or exaggerated claim. It was concrete, undeniable harm inflicted on a child who had done nothing more than build a school project. The judge set the photograph down with deliberate calm. Meredith's eyes darted nervously, sensing the momentum shifting beyond her control. Still, she clung to her delusion. She launched into a new justification, insisting the chemicals were only dangerous when mishandled, implying the burns were accidental and the child's fault. The judge listened with an expression carved from stone. Then came the moment that changed everything. The bailiff approached the bench to deliver a file additional documentation, confirming the exact nature of the spray Meredith had used. As the judge opened it and scanned the contents, her eyes didn't flicker, but something in her demeanor shifted. A depth of resolve sharpened her posture, a resolve rooted in both expertise and personal fury. Only then did Meredith catch the faintest glimmer of recognition. She stared harder, she squinted slightly, and as the judge addressed the courtroom again, articulating the legal implications of introducing a corrosive substance into a situation with no legitimate threat, something in her expression triggered a spark of memory in Meredith's mind, a flicker of confusion, then disbelief. Then dawning horror, she finally recognized the woman she had dismissed for years, the woman she had ignored at block parties, spoken over in meetings, and treated with polite condescension whenever discussions of community events arose. She recognized the mother of the child she sprayed. The realization sucked the remaining confidence from her stance. She stiffened, her mouth parting slightly, as though words might come, but none did. The judge continued with unwavering neutrality, offering no acknowledgement of the recognition flickering across Meredith's face. The courtroom watched, transfixed, for the first time in her long reign of neighborhood control. Meredith understood she could not manipulate or intimidate her way out of accountability. Not here, not now. Not in front of the woman whose child she had harmed. And as the judge prepared to call the next stage of testimony, the entire room felt the shift. The balance of power had changed in an instant. The reckoning had only just begun. The moment Meredith realized who stood before her on the bench, who held the authority to judge her actions, the courtroom atmosphere shifted in a way that every spectator could feel. It was no longer simply a case of one reckless homeowner harming a child. It had begun to reveal something deeper. The fragile facade of authority Meredith had wrapped around herself for years was beginning to dissolve. But the trial was far from over. The court still needed to examine the extent of the wrongdoing, the history that had led to this moment, and the broader web of negligence woven into the HOA's culture under Meredith's leadership. And as the proceedings resumed after a brief recess, the judge made one thing clear through her tone and precision: personal involvement or not, the truth would surface, and accountability would be carved out with clarity. The next witness called was not a neighbor, but a former HOA board member man whose tired eyes and careful posture suggested he had been carrying the weight of something he had long wished to leave behind. When sworn in, he stood with a kind of weary acceptance, as though he had finally found the courage to speak after years of silent complicity. The room leaned in, sensing the shift. He began recounting the internal operations of the HOA under Meredith's leadership. Over time, she had twisted the role of president from administrative management into personal dominion. She had insisted on conducting unscheduled inspections, claimed special access to private yards, and reinterpreted vague bylaws with increasingly invasive authority. According to him, she had pressured the board to approve fines without evidence, threatened those who questioned her decisions, and withheld HOA funds for projects she favored. He spoke of incidents the residents had never known, times when she had moved property boundary flags without permission, invalidating homeowners' landscaping efforts, times when she had used HOA resources to pressure individuals into repainting entire homes simply because she disliked the shade, times when she had overridden board voting procedures, forcing through decisions with intimidation instead of consensus. The judge listened without expression, though internally she understood with growing clarity the extent to which Meredith had weaponized her position. The courtroom absorbed each detail with a growing mixture of disgust and fascination, glimpsing the reality behind the polished newsletters and rigid rule enforcement as the testimony deepened. The former board member hesitated before revealing the final and most damning truth: the HOA's financial records. Under Meredith's supervision, thousands of dollars in community funds had been redirected into beautification initiatives that had never materialized. Landscaping projects were billed but never performed. Maintenance fees had doubled over 2 years with no visible improvements. And, most troubling, Meredith had personally signed off on reimbursements for purchases that had no legitimate association with HOA operations items labeled as inspection equipment, later revealed to be personal gadgets, apparel, and even spa services. A ripple of shock moved through the spectators. Some whispered, others sat rigid, stunned. Years of suspicion, long dismissed as exaggeration or paranoia, had finally crystallized into undeniable evidence. Meredith remained unnervingly still, her face pale, her posture strained. Every word spoken against her chipped away at the identity she had crafted, an identity rooted in control, superiority, and the delusion of moral authority. What remained was the beginnings of the truth: a woman whose need for dominance had spiraled into misconduct, harm, and now legal consequences. But the case was not solely about financial mismanagement or abuse of power. It was about the incident that brought everyone into the courtroom, the harm inflicted on a child. And now the prosecution presented the forensic report. The expert who stepped forward was composed and clinical, carrying a stack of documents and a calm determination. He explained the chemical composition of the cleaning agent Meredith had used. It was not a standard household spray. It had industrial-grade components designed to erode biological growth, strip stone surfaces, and dissolve stubborn staining. The dilution she used reduced its potency, but not its danger. The burns on Sam's skin matched exactly the corrosive pattern expected from such a substance. He concluded with a grave truth. Had the wind shifted slightly, or had the spray been more concentrated, the injuries could have been far more severe. The courtroom absorbed this with heavy silence. The judge studied the expert carefully, weighing his statements with solemn attention. It was one thing to act recklessly. It was another entirely to do so with a chemical known to cause significant harm, especially around a child. Then came the final witness of the day, a quiet neighbor whose voice trembled, yet whose testimony held immense weight. She admitted she had seen the entire incident unfold from her front window. She had watched Meredith march up the driveway. She had watched her examine the materials without permission. She had watched her raise the spray bottle and release the mist. And she had seen Sam scream and drop his project, confusion and pain washing over him. Her voice wavered as she recounted how she had frozen, unsure if stepping outside would escalate things further, too frightened of Meredith's retaliation to intervene. She described feeling guilty, deeply, painfully guilty, that fear had kept her silent until now. Her gaze flicked toward the judge, not seeking approval, but searching for some sense of closure. When she finished, the courtroom exhaled as one. The judge called for the day's session to end, her tone steady and authoritative. She summarized the need to review the testimonies, analyze the documents, and evaluate the legal implications before proceeding to the next phase. Her composure remained perfect, but inside, she carried the dual burden of professional duty and maternal instinctive forces she balanced without faltering as the courtroom emptied. The spectators left in scattered groups, buzzing with revelations. Neighbors who had feared speaking up now felt emboldened. Those who had suffered under Meredith's rule found validation in the testimonies. For the first time, Willow Crest felt a shift, one that suggested the oppressive structure they had lived under might finally collapse. Meredith remained seated longer than anyone. She stared at the bench where the judge had sat, her eyes cloudy with disbelief and fear. She had walked into the courthouse expecting to justify her actions, expecting admiration for her supposed vigilance. Instead, she had walked into a storm of accountability, a storm that stripped her authority layer by layer, and tomorrow, when the court reconvened, she would face the final unraveling of her empire, because the judge, my wife, was far from finished. The fourth day of the trial dawned with a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the mood surrounding Meredith's spiraling downfall. Willowcrest residents arrived in clumps, drawn not by morbid fascination, but by the sense of witnessing long-awaited accountability. What had begun as a simple case about an injured child had grown into a full-scale examination of the rot. Hidden beneath the HOA's immaculate veneer, inside the courthouse, the air felt heavier than before. People took their seats quietly, some clasping notebooks, others clutching folded copies of HOA statements or printouts of neighborhood bylaws, physical records of grievances they had carried privately for years. Even the bailiff moved with uncharacteristic solemnity. Understanding the weight of what this case had become, Meredith entered shortly after, but the confidence she had worn like armor on the first day was gone. Her steps were hesitant, her shoulders drawn inward, as though the space around her had grown too large to occupy with the authority she once wielded. She held her binder close, though it no longer resembled a shield, more like a relic of a crumbling regime. As she took her seat beside her attorney, several residents exchanged glances, recognizing that the woman who once terrorized their streets was finally beginning to look small. The judge returned to the bench with the same composed energy she carried throughout the trial. Her robe fell in clean lines, her face neutral and unreadable. Only those closest to her would notice the subtle steel in her posture, the quiet determination of a woman prepared to finish what had begun, with the proceedings called to order. The prosecution introduced new evidence, digital logs pulled from the HOA's internal communication system. At first glance, the logs seemed like routine administrative chatter reminders about dues, notes on maintenance schedules, and community announcements. But embedded within them were messages from Meredith that told a far darker story. There were messages in which she referred to homeowners as obstacles, asked problems to be corrected. Logs in which she instructed board members to fabricate reasons for issuing fines. Screenshots of directives in which she demanded unauthorized access to property photographs. Buried deeper in the files were communications hinting at personal vendettas she targeted not for rule violations, but for petty disagreements or perceived slights. The courtroom absorbed each revelation quietly, but the tension grew with every new display. These were not isolated abuses of power. They were part of a sustained pattern of manipulation, deceit, and coercion. The judge read through the logs one by one, occasionally asking for clarification, her tone unwavering. Her impartial discipline contrasted sharply with the chaos unraveling in the evidence. But beneath that calm, a quiet conviction solidified. What Meredith had done to Sam was not a spontaneous mistake. It was the product of a personality accustomed to control, enforced without restraint or regard for consequence. Meredith's attorney attempted to salvage the situation, arguing that the logs had been taken out of context or misinterpreted, insisting that the responsibilities of an HOA president required firm oversight. But the arguments lacked substance. Every justification had already been disproven by the testimonies heard in earlier sessions. Every attempt to reframe her actions fell flat against the mountain of documented misconduct. Finally, the prosecution called one last special witness, a compliance consultant, formerly employed by multiple HOAs throughout the county. She carried an air of practiced professionalism, her knowledge precise and deeply rooted in years of experience. Her analysis cut through the remnants of Meredith's defenses with clinical sharpness. She explained what proper HOA governance looked like, how checks and balances were meant to protect both homeowners and board members, and how leaders should adhere strictly to transparency protocols. She then contrasted that with the practices uncovered at Willow Crest, practices that indicated a board effectively hijacked by one individual's agenda. Her conclusion was damning. The Willow Crest HOA had become, under Meredith, an entity operating outside the standards of ethical or legal conduct. Her testimony delivered the final blow as she stepped down from the witness stand. Meredith slumped slightly in her seat, as though the weight of reality had finally settled upon her. Her attorney whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Her gaze drifted, unfocused, to the edge of the bench, where the judge's robe hung in clean, authoritative folds. It was then that the judge made a decisive move. She requested both counsels to approach for a conference. The courtroom watched in complete silence as the attorneys joined her. Though the words couldn't be heard, the tone was unmistakable, a tone of finality. When the attorneys returned to their respective tables, the judge announced that she would deliver a preliminary ruling on admissibility and legal standing before the next phase. Her voice carried with clarity and precision, but beneath it was the unmistakable gravity of someone delivering truth with unflinching resolve. She confirmed that the evidence presented had met the threshold for a full indictment on multiple counts, not just concerning the incident with the child, but also involving financial misconduct, abuse of power, and violations of community governance law. Gasps rippled across the courtroom, not loud, but sharp. The residents of Willow Crest realized, perhaps for the first time, how deeply this single case would reshape their community. The HOA would not simply be reformed, it would be rebuilt. But the greatest shock still rested with Meredith. The judge's words held no animosity, no vengeance, no sign that she was the mother of the injured child. Yet the truth was unmistakable. Justice was being delivered with the fierce impartiality of someone who understood the weight of harm and the necessity of accountability. Meredith's face went pale, her fingers trembled as she gripped the edge of her binder, and in a moment of stark vulnerability, she seemed to finally comprehend what she had wrought, not just in legal consequences, but in the unraveling of her identity. She had stood atop Willow Crest like a self-appointed monarch, believing control equaled power. Now that control was gone, stripped away by the collective truth of those she had oppressed. As the judge adjourned for the day, leaving her final ruling to be delivered after closing statements, the courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Neighbors exchanged glances of relief, disbelief, and cautious hope. Some paused to absorb the reality that justice, after years of quiet suffering, had finally arrived. Meredith remained motionless at the table long after everyone else had begun to file out. She stared at the now empty bench, her expression hollow, as though the world around her had shifted into a shape she no longer recognized. Tomorrow, the final chapter would unfold, and when it did, Meredith would face the full force of the consequences she had long escaped. The final day of the trial arrived with the kind of clarity rarely granted in life, as though the world itself had paused to witness the closing of a long and painful chapter. The sky above the courthouse glowed with a muted brightness, and a thin breeze drifted across the parking lot, carrying with it the low murmur of residents gathering once again, eager and anxious for what would unfold inside. They came not as spectators this time, but as a community standing on the cusp of transformation. Inside, the courtroom was already half full. People sat quietly, some clasping hands, others tapping restless fingers against their knees. In their faces, one could see the burden of years spent under the shadow of Meredith's authority and the rising hope that justice would untangle the knots she had tied around their lives. When Meredith entered, she carried the weight of her unraveling with her. Gone was the sharp blazer embroidered with the HOA emblem. Gone was the rigid posture and the unshakable confidence. She moved slowly, as if each step pulled from her a piece of the persona she once maintained. Her binder, the symbol of her self-fashioned power, rested limply in her hands, no longer wielded but simply held because it was all she had left. Her attorney followed behind with an expression of resignation. He had fought a losing battle for days, grasping at defenses that dissolved under evidence, testimony, and the cold precision of legal scrutiny. It was clear he knew the outcome, though he maintained the professional composure expected of someone who had long grown accustomed to difficult defeats. When the judge entered, everyone rose. My wife took her place on the bench with the same calm authority she had displayed throughout the trial. Her expression held no hint of personal connection, only the solemn weight of duty, sharpened by the responsibility of delivering a verdict that would ripple far beyond the four walls of the courtroom. Once the room settled, she invited closing statements. The prosecution spoke first, presenting a final, streamlined summary of the case: the injury inflicted upon a child, the reckless use of a corrosive substance, the unauthorized entry onto private property, the systemic abuse of HOA authority, and the significant financial mismanagement uncovered during the proceedings. It was a concise but powerful encapsulation of everything the trial had revealed. The defense attempted to counter with appeals to Meredith's intentions, describing her as misguided rather than malicious, overwhelmed rather than tyrannical. They insisted she had never intended harm and had acted according to her perceived responsibilities, but their words felt hollow, drowned beneath the overwhelming evidence and the experiences of every resident who had taken the stand. Even they seemed to recognize the futility. And then the judge began. Her ruling unfolded with a clarity that left no ambiguity. She addressed the incident involving Sam first, stating plainly that the evidence demonstrated reckless and dangerous conduct. The chemical burns, the witness testimony, and the forensic analysis all aligned in a way that made denial impossible. She declared Meredith responsible for assault with a harmful agent, trespassing, and causing bodily injury. Next, she reviewed the HOA misconduct, separating the personal infractions from the organizational corruption. She explained the gravity of falsified fines, fabricated violations, and unauthorized surveillance. She noted that while civil action regarding financial restitution would be handled separately, the criminal implications, namely fraud, extortion-like behavior, and misuse of community funds, were undeniable. The courtroom remained silent, every breath held in anticipation. Finally, the judge turned her attention toward what would happen next. Meredith would face financial penalties, mandatory restitution, and a ban from participating in any HOA leadership position for life. She would be removed as president effective immediately. A temporary oversight committee would be appointed to restructure and rebuild the HOA under lawful protocols, but it was the sentence related to the assault that drew the deepest reaction. The judge delivered a measured penalty: community service, mandatory counseling, and a suspended jail sentence contingent on compliance with all conditions and restitution payments. It was not harsh for the sake of punishment, but balanced in recognition of the severity of the harm and the potential for rehabilitation. For the first time, Meredith's composure fully crumbled. Her shoulders sagged, her chin trembled, and her gaze dropped to the table as her world collapsed in quiet, irreversible pieces. She did not speak. She did not cry out. She simply sat there, fully aware that the authority she clung to so fiercely had been stripped away by the very structure she once thought she controlled. The courtroom exhaled as one when the judge concluded her ruling, not in celebration, but in a collective shedding of years of tension, fear, and frustration. It felt as though the walls themselves loosened, freed from the weight of Meredith's long shadow. After the judge adjourned and stepped away from the bench, the room erupted in quiet murmurs of closure and relief. Neighbors approached one another, speaking softly, some offering comfort, others exchanging plans for rebuilding the community. For the first time in years, Willow Crest residents spoke with genuine hope. Meredith remained seated. The bailiff approached her gently, placing a hand on the table to signal that the hearing was over. She gathered her binder slowly, rising with the stiffness of someone carrying a burden she had accumulated entirely on her own. She walked toward the exit, passing through the crowd of people she had once ruled with an iron grip. Not one person stepped aside out of fear. Not one avoided eye contact out of intimidation. She was no longer their overseer. She was simply another resident of Willow Crest, now accountable to the same rules she had once twisted and weaponized. Outside, the wind brushed past her, scattering a few loose papers that dropped from her binder. She didn't chase them, she barely seemed to notice. Instead, she disappeared into the parking lots, smaller, quieter, and unmistakably humbled. Inside, my wife removed her robe in the privacy of her chambers. It was only there, far from the public eye, that the emotion she kept contained finally flickered across her expression. Relief that justice had been served. Gratitude that our son would never again be a target of Meredith's recklessness. And quiet pride in knowing she had upheld her duty with fairness. Even when the case touched her family so personally, in the days that followed, Willowcrest began to change. The temporary oversight committee took immediate action, opening the books, revising bylaws, restoring transparency. Residents found their voices, participating in meetings with a sense of empowerment they hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood, once stifled under a single person's control, slowly rediscovered the meaning of community, and our son healed. His burns faded gradually, leaving behind faint marks that would soon be gone entirely. He returned to school with a renewed sense of safety, surrounded by neighbors who now looked out for him with genuine care. The HOA that had once represented fear now began to symbolize something new: fairness, accountability, and unity. And Meredith, once the tyrant of Willow Crestby, came a cautionary tale rather than a threat. Justice had been served, the neighborhood had been restored, and our family, stronger than before, stood together through the storm and into the calm that followed.